our RICE regulations, as we call them. So we just wanted to give you a few updates on what's changed since we last spoke, and then talk about kind of our lessons learned from implementation. So in terms of what's new with the regulations, the most recent would be the proposal's been signed but hasn't been published yet in the Federal Register. Updates to our two new source performance standards regulations. So that's the subpart III and JJJJ of Part 60. If you spend any time working with those regulations, you know that they both reference the provisions for non-road engines, particularly like the emission standards for non-road engines and certification procedures and things like that, because we adopted some of those same standards and procedures for stationary engines. So our office that oversees the non-road engine provisions, which is our Office of Transportation and Air Quality, or OTAC, is getting rid of some of their Code of Federal Regulations sections for non-road engines because they identify emission standards and procedures that they no longer use for non-road engines. And that's for what affects us is they're getting rid of Part 89, which has the Tier 2 and Tier 3 standards for compression ignition engines, and then Part 90 and Part 94. So what that means for us is we're revising our NSPS regulations to get rid of those references to the parts that are being removed, and it's part of a broader set. Our NSPS revision is part of a bigger rulemaking where they're doing a bunch of other things, but the effect is not really. It doesn't really change anything about the stringency of our regulations, because where they're getting rid of something like Part 89, they're moving the relevant parts of Part 89 that contain those standards and moving them to a different place. So basically we're just changing the place that we're referring to, but we're not changing anything about the stringency. And I'm going to show, and so I have a link here to the website that shows you, that has the proposed rule. And I was just going to go to the website and show you right here. So this is their website, and they have the proposed rule there, which again is the quote unquote pre-publication version. And then they also have this memo here that highlights the changes to the rule. So if you open up the memo and you go and you can see it's a very long 800 and something pages, but if you find the few pages for the NSPS, you can see this is an example here. This is in the compression ignition engine NSPS, and where we reference the Tier 2 and Tier 3 standards, we used to refer to Part 89. Now it's going to be referring to this Part 1039 Appendix I, which is a new appendix that they're adding to Part 1039, which is the Tier 4 standards, and bringing those Tier 2 and Tier 3 standards from Part 89 to Part 1039. So it's not changing anything about the stringency, it's just changing where the standards are housed. And we've known that this was going to happen for a few years now, and we actually posted a memo on our RICE website in 2017 that has redline strikeout text that showed what we were going to be changing, and that was kind of to give advance notice to stakeholders like engine manufacturers, for example, so they could be aware that this was coming, and now we finally gotten the rule out. I don't know what the schedule is for the final rule, but I'm assuming since it's a pretty big rule, it's not going to be soon. So does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. So hearing nothing, going to move on to the second change, which was amendments that were recently proposed. Well, they were proposed in November of 2019. So just as background, in 2011, we revised our compression ignition engine NSPS to specify that new engines in remote areas of Alaska would not have to meet the Tier 4 standards for NOx, CO, and hydrocarbons. We said, they could they still had to meet tier 3, so it wasn't that they had no standard, but they just didn't have to meet the more stringent tier 4 standard. And then we were asked by some stakeholders in Alaska, including the governor of Alaska, to extend that provision to the PM standards as well. The 2011 rule still left that requirement to meet tier 4 for PM in place, although we did say that alternatively they could meet a 85% reduction if they didn't meet the tier 4 standard. So as I said, some stakeholders asked that we extend that to PM. Congress also passed and the president signed this Alaska Remote Generator Reliability and Protection Act, which required us to do this rule. We were already well on the way to doing the rule when the act finally passed. But so in November of 2019, we issued a final rule that extended that same provision to PM. So it said, for remote areas of Alaska, engines that are installed there can meet tier 3 for all of the pollutants, so NOx, CO, hydrocarbon, and PM. And if you're wondering what do we consider to be a remote area, so this map here shows you Alaska, and basically we're talking about areas that are not accessible by the federal aid highway system, which is the red area that you see, and then the marine highway, or that are accessible but that are not on the rail belt grid, which is the pink area, and are pretty small. And I'm going to stop there and let Jim kind of elaborate on some of the more of the history and the background on this.
Yeah, this designation of what's considered remote in Alaska has been bounced around for a long time. And if you look at the road system map that Melanie put up, there are spur roads off the side, but the majority of those are gravel. There are very few well-maintained roads off this grid system and the national highway system. And of course, we're highly dependent on the marine ferry. The blue ports, the ferry ports, are the main ferry system stops. Only a few of them were actually put in using federal money that qualify as part of the federal aid highway system. And there are a lot of others that the state put in later that are still considered remote ports and don't qualify. But it's difficult getting around up here, very dependent on air travel, very dependent on weather. You get weathered in or out of a lot of these places for weeks at a time. So the circumstances are a bit unique. You could you could have a generator fail out in a remote portion of Alaska and not be able to get a technician there for a week or 2 weeks. And if you send them out, you may not get them back for a week or 2 weeks. And frankly, there aren't a lot of hotels out in these small towns. They usually end up camping on the floor of somebody's house in the village. So it presents some unique challenges. The PM standards were one we looked at, prompted by various stakeholders, because there is no PM issue in ambient air out in Alaska. There are no non-attainment zones or maintenance areas or anything that would give rise, and the vast majority of your PM out there is coming from wood smoke, from wood-fired heating devices. So it was looked at as a way to improve the reliability, because these aftermarket control devices are difficult to maintain. They require CAT certified technicians. They are not something that you could easily maintain out in the bush by yourself. A lot of times out in these remote power plants, they're unmanned. The guy who operates the power plant during the day, he checks the engine operation, and then he starts heading around collecting electricity bills from people. So there's a good portion of unmanned utilities out there, and there is no interconnected grid. So most of the villages on small diesel engines are on their own, and that's something that we have to deal with. And really want to thank Melanie how fast they worked this issue through and got the rule to happen. So I think that's about it.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. So one other thing I wanted to mention was we've been getting a few questions, and I'm sure we're not alone, about compliance, during the coronavirus. And so what I would, that's not something that I would deal with. I mean, that's an, enforcement and compliance issue. So I've been directing people to the EPA website, which is just epa.gov/coronavirus. And if you go there, if you scroll over under enforcement and compliance, there's this enforcement and compliance resources. And then there's a policy, a temporary enforcement policy that EPA put out. So all that information is here. So, as I've been getting questions, do I have to do my stack test, or, do I have to do my maintenance? I've just been directing people here into our Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance. So does anybody have any, and Sara, is there anything else you wanted to add on that?
No, Melanie, but I think I can chime in with a little bit because anyone looking at that map previously, our compliance section has really taken this to heart because, for example, the North Slope closed travel. So going up to the oil facilities up there just isn't happening. And that includes scheduled stack tests, on-site inspections, and a lot of crew changes aren't happening. They've extended a lot of crew rotations up there, trying to keep exposure to the virus down. So we've had a lot of compliance enforcement discretion cases come up where, if you can't get a stack test team in, how are we going to hold you accountable for doing a stack test on time? And those questions go to our compliance section, but there's been a lot of discretion applied to that enforcement policies.
Yeah, this is Donovan in Tennessee. I believe Tennessee adopted a similar discretionary enforcement policy, as well as for record keeping purposes on some things like hazardous waste inspection, because if nobody's at the facility to do the inspection, we certainly understand. I think Nancy in Region 7 had said there's pretty much a general Region 7 enforcement discretion that was issued right about the same time that the EPA national policy came out.
Jim, this is Mark Stoddard in Indiana. Maybe prior to the COVID crisis, how likely was it for someone to completely revamp or replace extensively an engine to make it run longer without having to maybe
Well, part of what kicked this rulemaking in that Melanie went through was the remote bush utilities out in Alaska. They're poor, and I want to emphasize probably capital letters, they're poor. Alaska Energy Authority has been using grant money to upgrade the powerhouses, and a lot of these utilities are running old engines that parts are no longer available. They scavenge parts from off-road sites or even eBay trying to find parts to keep those things running. So AEA has been upgrading the powerhouses with newer, mostly marine diesels, because they use the waste heat jacket water for other purposes in the powerhouse. So they've been going through them. Let me check my notes. 538 of these engines out in remote powerhouses. Each powerhouse normally has 2 to 3 below 800 horsepower, and they've been replacing them on a schedule. They do 30 to 40 replacements of these units a year before COVID hit in. They're not doing any now because they can't get out to the sites. But it's a big thing. There are a lot of museum quality diesel engines out there in remote Alaska. So yeah, we've been replacing them.
So the last thing I was going to have a slide on, you know, we were asked to talk about lessons learned from implementation. So these are just a few things that I thought of, and I checked with a couple of our regional office folks who are, you know, heavily involved with implementation and incorporated their suggestions as well. I mean, the first one that comes to mind is a complicated reg makes compliance difficult. You know, we have a very you know, a lot of subcategories, a lot of different types of engines, a large number of engines, a reg that's not really easy to read, you know, that references other regs. And so that makes it challenging for people to figure out what they need to do to comply. Right. So having good state and local partners that, you know, are familiar with the rule, you know, helps us, because then, you know, they can help answer questions. You know, writing it in a plain language that people can understand, and then doing outreach and making sort of plain language guidance is really important. And, you know, we've done some compliance tools for the rule, and, you know, those have seemed to be well received. So kind of when you're, you know, we tend to sort of write a rule and then start thinking about these things. And, you know, I've sort of learned along as the years have gone by that I should be thinking about these things while I'm writing the rule, not afterwards. Another thing is having such a large and diverse subcategory, you know, where you have a lot of different applications, where you've got, you know, you've got agriculture, you've got oil and gas, you've got power generation, you've got landfills, you know, a lot of different industries, makes having a sort of one size fits all compliance requirements challenging. You know, trying to come up with maintenance requirements or monitoring requirements that every single engine, you know, in a subcategory can do is pretty challenging. And that's where we tend to run into a lot of the, you know, sort of alternative monitoring requests and things that, you know, that we get is from maybe these sort of niche engines that, you know, no one really brought to our attention. For example, we've had some issues with shredder engines, and the fact that they operate, you know, in such a way where they ramp up really fast and then power down, and then, you know, a little while later ramp up really fast and power down. You know, it makes compliance difficult for them. So, you know, having such a diverse group of sources makes doing a rulemaking challenging. Another thing is, you got to know the specifics about your engine in order to figure out what you need to do to comply. We have people that call up and say, I need, tell me what I need to do, but they don't know, is it a spark ignition engine? When was it constructed? What's the horsepower? Is it certified? That kind of thing. So having people know that they, need to know all these things and need to keep records, or, if they're buying an engine, need to get these kinds of records is really not necessarily always the reality on the ground, we find. And then another thing is, it would be great if we were doing more electronic collection of information. At the time that we originally wrote these rules, EPA didn't really have the systems in place to do the electronic reporting that we now have. So there's a lot of, testing information that gets, submitted that I never see. So then, when I get ready to, for example, do the risk and technology review for this rule, I won't have information about what these engines are actually emitting. So to the extent that we could be, and what should have been incorporating electronic reporting, that would really help us out down the road. I'll stop there and see if anybody else has any other comments or things that they want to share.
Hey, Melanie, this is Jennifer from Michigan. And just to your last point there about electronic collection, I was wondering if you guys are thinking of trying to get or glean some information from emissions reporting from the states on these, because I know obviously some of this information is collected, at least as far as emissions go, based on NAICS codes, et cetera, SIC codes at a state level. Might just be interesting to pull some of that information. And then my second question is, at least here in Michigan, one of the biggest questions I'm getting on engines, which I will just caveat to say that I hate this whole subset of rules. All of them are so complicated. I feel like there was such an easier way to write these. But one of the main questions I'm getting lately is generators and engines that are being used for quote unquote national security right now during the COVID crisis. And I didn't know if there was some specific outreach you guys were doing to some of our military partners as far as that goes. So comment, and I guess a couple questions in there, and let me know if you want me to reiterate that.
So on your second one, I'm not aware of any outreach. It's any military bases or anything like that. That doesn't mean it's not happening. It just hasn't reached me. And then on the electronic collection, I think as we have not been sued to do the risk and technology review for this rule yet. I expect we probably will be. So we've been kind of thinking about, okay, what kind of information do we need in order to be able to do that? And certainly getting emissions data is something that we're going to need. So we've been starting to talk about, okay, what do we need to do? What information is out there? So I expect, it's just we've been kind of tied up doing other, like I was working on the turbine risk and technology review. But now that that's finished, we're going to try to turn to, okay, what information do we need to get? Because doing the risk and technology review for this rule is going to be a challenge because it's such a large group of engines. So I think that that's something we'll be, over the coming months, we'll be starting to look into a little bit more.
Awesome, thank you. And I have another question, but I'll let other people go first if they have other things.
Hello, this is Belinda. I had a question going a little bit back into what you had just said, and I was wondering how big the universe of manufacturers for these different engines are, and if that might be a good source for outreach to let people know, if you're looking at this engine, these are the types of things you'll have to comply with.
Yeah, there's certainly, a handful of manufacturers that dominate. Unfortunately, and they work pretty well with us, and I think they do some effort. They make some efforts to advise people about rules, but a lot of engines don't necessarily come straight from the manufacturers. They go through dealers, and there's a lot more of them, and then they get sold and resold and rented, and there's a lot of middlemen, I guess you might call them, out there. So that's a good thought, to try to use them, but I think it's not something we've focused on too much. Other than when the engines are certified, then the manufacturer does have to provide some information about maintenance and that sort of thing.
So this is Jennifer from Michigan again. Sorry. You don't know me, but I always have a lot of questions, so I try to be brief. But so you talked a lot about plain language, and I already told you how I feel about all of these rules. And so I was wondering, one of the challenges that we see here, going back to facilities not knowing what their obligations are, and I know ignorance is not an excuse, but I was wondering if there is any plain language outreach that exists on identifying when reconstruction occurs, because as I listened to the gentleman from Alaska talk about parsing out parts from eBay and wherever you can scramble to get them to make these engines keep functioning. I mean, at some point, are we triggering reconstruction on these? And I know we've had some situations here where there's been change outs that were, quote, like for like, but really should have triggered some sort of notification and other action. So I just didn't know, is there some plain language outreach that we could point facilities to that might identify more what those parameters are?
Yeah, this is Melanie. I don't know about any sort of general guidance. I mean, I know we've written a few like applicability determination type letters. Is Sara, are you on? Sara Ayres?
Well, the NESHAP and NSPS both have definitions of what constitutes a reconstruction.
Hi, this is Sara. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I think I must have been on mute before. So yeah, there's not any formal guidance on reconstruction for engines that I'm aware of. A lot of the reconstruction guidance that EPA has put out in the past has been relatively informal, and it's not been in the engines realm. But as Melanie said, we've had some specific determinations about whether or not a specific action by a facility was reconstruction or not. And we have some general guidance about what constitutes reconstruction in broader terms. But yeah, I'm not aware of anything specific that would be, really sort of step by step, like what parts of the equipment would be considered part of the unit and all the stuff that you need to do in order to do the, the calculation.
Right, and I guess that's where I'm going with this, is I feel like, because as we've been talking about this, we know that these engines, and not just these particular engines, but engines in general, is such a large subset that are used in so many different applications and so many different places, from Lowe's to the oil and gas landfills, all of that. And so I get that there's applicability indexes, but I think that's just one of those things that people just don't know to go to. And so for us, being small business assistance people, it would be really nice to have something that was more like plain language focused, that could help a larger subset of individuals operating engines to kind of determine, like, okay, is this general maintenance? Is this reconstruction? Like, where am I going with this? I think a lot of these companies that use these, they don't even know that there's a thing that's reconstruction. So I'm just putting that out there, kind of playing devil's advocate on this, and maybe that it will give this group, our group, a little bit more to think about, of some things that we might be able to focus on in the future too.
No, I mean, I think anything we can do to raise awareness is always good. I know there have been some recent things that might make guidance a little more difficult for us to provide. Recent executive orders and things like that.
Right. Yeah, I think that's something that we can definitely, like, our group works on that. Mark, I'm sorry to speak over you. I think I heard you.
No problem.
But I think that's something that our group really does well. And, you know, we've definitely partnered with EPA on a lot of things like this before. And I suppose what we've done in the past is, you know, we've tried to work with you guys to set something up through our mechanisms, and then allowing for you to review and make sure we're not misspeaking, I guess, would be kind of the you know, the thing. So for our subcommittee, it would be maybe something that we can focus on. I know we had engines on our national training list as far as, and I might have been the pusher of that, so I apologize in advance, everyone. I find this such a challenging subset of rules to get out there and explain to people and show them, you know. Even an email I just got as we've been talking from one of my military folks saying, I've read more about this and I'm even more confused now. And that's giving them the resources that we have that are quote unquote plain language. So anyway, just putting that out there. So I appreciate the feedback, Melanie, on all of that. And Sara.
This is Mark again. What I was going to say, we have an Amish community, and there are probably several other states. And so the difficulty is trying to communicate in their own language. So I'm wondering if, and again, I don't know how prevalent, but I think Amish are famous for making something last for a long, long time. So I'm certain that if you do an oil change or replace some rings on some pistons or whatever you might find as a comparable part on a compression ignition engine, that wouldn't trigger reconstruction. But I mean, what might be typical for a reconstruction activity on an engine, and from what I understand, it'd have to be the price of the reconstruction would have to be at least 50% or more, I think, of the original cost of the engine. So I would think that would have to be something pretty significant. So if you had some idea of what, you know, the types of activities that would be reconstruction would involve, then you could indicate here are things, here are some reconstruction activities that might typically trigger this, and here are some things that wouldn't. I don't know what's easier. It would just be trying to understand what the nature of what that reconstruction would look like. Rebuilding the engine, reboring the, again, I'm thinking spark ignition, I suppose. I don't really understand the compression ignition, but I assume they have rings and cylinders, and so what would you replace that might trigger a reconstruction? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all you know, associated with the cost. So it's not like we can say doing this certain activity would automatically trigger it.
I was a compliance inspector for a long time, and that's one of the most difficult things, because every diesel engine requires overhaul after so many thousand hours. And doing a top end where you pull the heads, pull the cylinder sleeves, replace those, that's kind of routine maintenance. If you're doing anything more than that, that's where you have to get into the accounting side and say, well, you know, how much did the parts and labor cost compared to replacing the engine? If you have a cracked block, that's probably one of the obvious examples, but not one of the more common things. So what Melanie's in a really bad position of trying to be too specific on that, because there's so many instances and variations of what an overhaul would comprise and how much it costs.
Jim, I greatly appreciate your explanation, especially your expertise. That goes a long way to help me what would be typical and routine and not likely. And also, I can appreciate, there might be more extensive repair, but just what you talked about, what might be typical repair or a refurbishment or a overhaul after so many hours of operation. that might not likely trigger a reconstruction. And there's a lot to be said about experience and being able to go out and see these things and know what is typical and what's going to be more significant. And I don't have that experience, so I'm lacking. So I'm kind of groping for some, I guess, bright line to say if you're on one side of the bright line, you don't have reconstruction. If you're on the other side, you do have reconstruction.
Yeah, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions at any other time. What we trained our compliance inspectors were on was if it was in the manual as routine overhaul, then they were probably okay unless something piqued their interest. But if it went beyond what the tech manual for the engine said, if they had an engine fire or wipe the bearings on the crankshaft, if the task went beyond what was in routine maintenance of the technical publication, that's when they needed to start investigating. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes perfect sense. Thank you.
So does anybody have any other comments, questions, suggestions? This was all we had, so.
Melanie and Jim and Sarah, I greatly appreciate the time you took to prepare and to share your knowledge and share your experiences. Any bit of knowledge helps us a long way, especially as we try to do, pretty much what you're trying to do in terms of providing information to people who need it, so they know what they need to do and how to do it. And it's a kind of an ongoing struggle with trying to understand what the rules are saying and how we go about conveying that knowledge to people who may have a difficult time comprehending the regulations.
Well, we certainly appreciate your partnership and your helping to get the word out to people so that they know what they need to do to comply.
Yeah, I like to think of it be like a feedback loop.
Yes.
If we hear things or we become aware of things, or if you know of things, like a particular compliance issue or maybe a comprehension issue, especially as technology changes and we have more electronic devices, maybe even having more perhaps phone devices too, some type of application that could be readily pulled up. So, we're in the electronic age, and now we're looking at, trying to find ways of providing audiovisual information or things that are readily available to your smartphone, as an example. Anyone else out there? There's got to be other people with questions.
This is Rhonda. I just want to thank Melanie and Sarah again for participating on the call. Jim, you as well. If there's any other questions for us, feel free to shoot me an email, or you can contact Melanie King or Sarah Ayres. And that's for any other topic, future topics for this technical subcommittee. I just want to offer our support. If you have any questions, or if you have another topic you would like for us to present to you, please feel free to reach out to me. My name is Rhonda Wright. You can email me at wright.rhonda@epa.gov. and we'll work on trying to provide you with the support needed.
All right, Rhonda and Melanie and Sarah, thank you for that. And Rhonda, thank you for helping arrange this. Since we seem to be winding down, if there are no further questions.
Hey, Donovan, it's Jennifer again. If the speakers want to sign off, but can the group, the subcommittee stay on? So maybe we can just talk about what's coming up and if there's plans as far as what is going to happen with our topics for the, from the national training. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah, that would be great. In fact, actually, I was thinking, Donovan, you could get maybe give them just before people leave or too many more people leave, tell them what next month's going to be.
That's actually what I was leading into.
Good.
So in answer to your question, Jennifer, several of the topics that we had been planning for the annual training, we were looking at bringing them straight into a